The morning mist clung to the towering pines of Olympic National Forest like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip on the Washington wilderness. September 15th, 1963, dawned crisp and clear in the Pacific Northwest, with the promise of one of those perfect autumn days that made locals forget about the region's notorious rainy reputation. 22-year-old Thomas Mitchell from Spokane had risen before sunrise, methodically packing his olive-green Chevrolet pickup truck with camping gear that showed the careful attention to detail of a military man. Thomas had served 2 tours in Korea, returning home in 1959 with memories that haunted his sleep and a Purple Heart he kept hidden in his dresser drawer. The nightmares had been getting worse lately. Images of frozen battlefields and fallen comrades that jolted him awake in a cold sweat. His doctor at the VA hospital in Spokane had suggested that time in nature might help calm his troubled mind. And Thomas had seized on the idea like a drowning man grabbing a life preserver. Before we continue with Thomas's story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, whether you're joining us from the Pacific Northwest like Thomas, or somewhere completely different. Your support means the world to us as we bring you these mysterious stories. Olympic National Forest held special meaning for Thomas. His father, Robert Mitchell, had first brought him to these woods when he was 8 years old, teaching him to tie fishing flies by the light of their campfire and showing him how to read the forest's subtle signs. Which mushrooms were safe to eat, how to find north without a compass, where deer came to drink at dawn. Those had been simpler times before the war had changed everything, when Thomas believed the world was fundamentally good and that bad things only happened to other people. Now, as he drove his truck along the winding forest roads toward Crystal Lake, Thomas felt the familiar weight of his father's expectations pressing down on his shoulders. Robert Mitchell was a logger who'd worked these same forests for 30 years, a man who believed that hard work and moral character could overcome any obstacle. He'd never quite understood why his son had come back from Korea different, quieter, more prone to staring off into space, jumping at sudden noises. "You just need to get back to nature, son," Robert had said when Thomas announced his camping plans. "These woods will remind you who you are." The campsite Thomas chose sat on a small peninsula that jutted into Crystal Lake, surrounded by old-growth Douglas firs that stretched toward the sky like cathedral spires. The water was so clear he could see rainbow trout swimming in the shallows, their scales catching the filtered sunlight that penetrated the forest canopy. He set up his military surplus canvas tent with practiced efficiency. Every rope staked at precisely the correct angle, every item in his pack organized according to the system he'd learned in basic training. That first evening, as Thomas cooked a simple meal of beans and bacon over his carefully constructed campfire, he felt something he hadn't experienced since before the war: genuine peace. The forest was alive with sounds that spoke to something primal in his soul. The gentle lapping of water against the shore, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant call of a loon somewhere across the lake. He wrote in his journal that night, by the flickering light of his fire, documenting not just the practical details of his campsite, but his emotional state as well. September 15th, 1963, he wrote in his careful script, "First day at Crystal Lake." The memories are already starting to fade, not disappear, but lose their sharp edges. Maybe Dad was right about these woods having healing power. Tomorrow I plan to explore some of the trails that lead away from the main camping area. I remember him telling me stories about hidden valleys and secret fishing spots that only the old-timers knew about. If I can find some of those places, maybe I can find myself too. Sleep came easier that night than it had in months. Instead of the usual nightmares about frozen foxholes and artillery bombardments, Thomas dreamed of fishing with his father, of campfires and stories, of a time when the future seemed bright with possibility. He woke naturally with the sunrise, feeling more rested than he had since his discharge from the army 4 years earlier. The second day dawned even clearer than the first, with a crisp bite in the air that promised the changing season. Thomas ate a breakfast of coffee, eggs, and toast prepared over his camp stove while studying the topographical map he'd purchased at the ranger station in Port Angeles. The network of trails around Crystal Lake was more extensive than he'd remembered, with several paths leading deep into the wilderness areas that remained largely unexplored by casual hikers. One trail in particular caught his attention, a dotted line on the map that led northeast toward an area marked as Timber Creek Valley. His father had mentioned this region during their camping trips, describing it as some of the wildest country left in the Olympics, a place where a man could walk for days without seeing another human soul. The trail looked challenging, but manageable for someone with Thomas's military training and outdoor experience. He packed light for the day hike, just his compass, topographical map, water canteen, some jerky and hardtack, a first aid kit, and his father's old hunting knife. The knife was a family heirloom, passed down from his grandfather who'd homesteaded in eastern Washington in the 1890s. Its worn wooden handle felt comfortable in his palm, a tangible connection to his family's history of self-reliance and wilderness survival. The trail began innocuously enough, winding through mixed forest, dominated by Douglas fir and western hemlock. Thomas moved at a steady pace, pausing occasionally to identify bird calls or examine interesting rock formations. His military training had taught him to observe his surroundings carefully, noting landmarks that would help him navigate back to his starting point. The forest floor was carpeted with decades of fallen needles that muffled his footsteps, creating an almost cathedral-like silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. As he hiked deeper into the wilderness, Thomas began to understand why his father had spoken of this area with such reverence. This was old forest, the kind that had stood for centuries before the first European settlers arrived in the Pacific Northwest. Some of the Douglas firs he passed were massive specimens, their trunks so wide that it would take several men holding hands to encircle them. Moss hung from their branches like ancient tapestries, and the filtered sunlight created an ever-changing pattern of light and shadow on the forest floor. After 2 hours of steady hiking, Thomas reached the first significant landmark marked on his map, a rocky outcropping that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding wilderness. From this vantage point, he could see for miles in every direction, an unbroken expanse of green that stretched to the horizon. To the north, the snow-capped peaks of the Olympic Mountains rose like ancient sentinels. To the south, he could just make out the distant glimmer of Puget Sound through a gap in the hills. It was here, standing on that windswept outcrop, with the entire Pacific Northwest spread out below him, that Thomas Mitchell made the decision that would seal his fate. Instead of turning back toward Crystal Lake as he'd originally planned, he decided to continue deeper into Timber Creek Valley. The map showed the trail continuing for several more miles before eventually looping back toward the main forest road, and Thomas felt drawn to explore this more remote section of wilderness. The real adventure always begins where the maps end, his father had often said during their camping trips. Looking at the increasingly sparse markings on his topographical map, Thomas felt a familiar thrill of anticipation mixed with caution. This was exactly the kind of challenge he needed, a chance to test his skills against the wilderness and prove to himself that the war hadn't broken something essential inside him. He made careful note of the time, 11:30 a.m., and his position on the map before starting the descent into Timber Creek Valley. The trail became noticeably more challenging as it wound downward through increasingly dense forest. In some places, fallen logs blocked the path, forcing Thomas to climb over or around them. In others, the trail seemed to disappear entirely, marked only by occasional blazes carved into tree trunks by previous hikers. As he descended into the valley, Thomas noticed that the character of the forest was changing. The trees grew closer together here, their canopy so dense that very little sunlight reached the ground. The air felt different too, cooler and more humid, with a faint smell of decay that reminded him uncomfortably of the Korean battlefields where he'd spent too many months. He shook off the association, focusing instead on the immediate task of following the increasingly faint trail. By early afternoon, Thomas realized he was truly in wilderness now. The blazes that had marked the trail became fewer and farther between, and several times he had to backtrack when he realized he'd lost the path entirely. His military training served him well in these situations. He never panicked, always maintained his sense of direction, and carefully noted landmarks that would help him retrace his steps. It was approaching 3 p.m. when Thomas heard the sound that would draw him toward his doom. The distant murmur of running water that indicated he was nearing Timber Creek itself. According to his map, the creek marked the deepest penetration into the wilderness area, the point where he should turn around and begin the long hike back to his campsite. But as he pushed through a particularly dense thicket of salmonberry and devil's club, Thomas discovered something that wasn't marked on any map. Hidden in a grove of ancient cedars, partially concealed by decades of windfall and undergrowth, stood the remains of what appeared to be an old cabin. The structure was in an advanced state of decay, with most of the roof caved in and walls that listed at dangerous angles. But there was something about the way it had been built, the careful notching of the logs, the stone foundation that had withstood decades of Pacific Northwest weather, that suggested this had once been someone's permanent home. Thomas approached the ruins cautiously, his military instincts alert for any sign of danger. The cabin appeared to have been abandoned for many years, possibly decades. Moss and ferns had claimed much of the structure, and several small trees had grown up through gaps in the collapsed roof. But as he circled the perimeter, looking for clues about who might have lived in this remote location, Thomas noticed something that made him stop short. Carved into a large cedar tree near the cabin's front door was a series of marks that looked almost like a crude calendar or record-keeping system. Dozens of vertical lines were scratched into the bark, grouped in sets of 5, like a prisoner marking days. But these weren't random scratches. They showed a deliberate pattern, as if someone had been keeping track of time or events over an extended period. The marks looked old, weathered by years of exposure to the elements, but not so old as to be indecipherable. More disturbing were the other signs Thomas began to notice as he examined the area more closely. Scattered around the cabin ruins were items that seemed out of place in the wilderness. Fragments of clothing, pieces of metal that might once have been camping gear, and bones that were too large and numerous to belong to the small forest animals he would have expected to find. His military experience had unfortunately given him enough familiarity with human remains to recognize what he was seeing. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool afternoon air. Every instinct developed during his combat tours was screaming at him to leave this place immediately, to get back on the trail and return to the safety of his campsite. But another part of him, the part trained to investigate and report unusual situations, compelled him to look more closely at what he'd discovered. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the forest grew darker, Thomas Mitchell made his final journal entry, writing by the fading light that filtered through the canopy. Found something strange in the valley. Old cabin, looks abandoned for years, but signs that someone was here more recently. Something doesn't feel right about this place. If something happens to me, tell Mom and Dad I was trying to find my way back to who I used to be. The trail back to camp starts at the big cedar with the markings, follow Timber Creek upstream. He never had the chance to finish that entry. As darkness fell over the Olympic wilderness, Thomas Mitchell simply vanished, leaving behind only questions that would haunt his family and the local community for 35 years. The forest that had promised healing instead claimed another victim, adding his name to a list that was far longer than anyone could have imagined. The search for Thomas Mitchell began 4 days later, when he failed to report for his new job at the Boeing plant in Seattle. His supervisor, a punctual man who took employee reliability seriously, had called the Spokane apartment where Thomas was supposed to be living temporarily while he looked for permanent housing. The landlord, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, was a middle-aged widow who took a motherly interest in her younger tenants, particularly those who were military veterans. Mrs. Patterson knew that Thomas had planned a week-long camping trip to the Olympic Peninsula before starting his job, and she wasn't initially concerned when he failed to return on schedule. Young men, especially those who'd served in the military, sometimes needed extra time to decompress and adjust to civilian life. She'd seen it before with other veteran tenants, good men who struggled with nightmares and restlessness, who found peace only in the wilderness. But when Thomas didn't return by the weekend, Mrs. Patterson's maternal instincts kicked into high gear. She called his parents in Colville, hoping they might have heard from their son or know of a change in his plans. The conversation with Martha Mitchell revealed that Thomas had indeed gone camping alone in the Olympic National Forest, planning to spend a week at Crystal Lake before returning to start his new life in Seattle. Martha Mitchell's voice carried a note of worry that resonated with Mrs. Patterson's own growing concern. "Thomas is always so reliable," Martha told her over the crackling long-distance connection. "Even during the war, his letters came like clockwork every week. If he said he'd be back by Thursday, something must have happened to prevent it." Robert Mitchell, Thomas's father, was a practical man who'd spent his entire adult life working in the woods. He knew better than most people how quickly the wilderness could claim even experienced outdoorsmen. When his wife hung up the phone after talking to Mrs. Patterson, Robert was already pulling on his boots and reaching for the truck keys. "We're going to Olympic," he told Martha simply. "If Thomas is in trouble, we need to find him before it gets worse." The drive from Colville to the Olympic Peninsula took the better part of a day in 1963, following winding two-lane highways through the Cascade Mountains and across the Puget Sound region. Robert drove with grim determination while Martha sat silently beside him, clutching Thomas's last letter home, a brief note written just before his camping trip in which he'd expressed hope that the time in nature would help him sleep better. They reached the Crystal Lake area just as the sun was setting on September 22nd, 7 days after Thomas had originally planned to break camp and return home. Robert's logging experience made him an expert tracker, and it didn't take him long to locate his son's abandoned campsite. What they found there sent chills down both parents' spines. The campsite was eerily preserved, as if Thomas had simply stepped away for a few minutes and planned to return shortly. His canvas tent remained properly staked and zipped shut, with his sleeping bag rolled neatly at the foot and his personal belongings organized with military precision. The remains of his last campfire sat cold in a circle of stones, with a coffee pot still sitting on the grate where he'd left it. Most unsettling was the discovery of Thomas's truck keys, hanging from a small hook he'd fashioned from a bent nail and attached to the inside wall of his tent. No experienced camper would venture far from his campsite without taking his keys, especially not in wilderness as remote as this. It suggested that whatever had happened to Thomas occurred close to his camp, or that he'd planned to return quickly from wherever he'd gone. Robert spent the remaining daylight hours searching the immediate area around the campsite, calling Thomas's name and looking for any sign of where his son might have gone. His logger's eye picked up faint traces of a trail leading away from the lake toward the northeast, disturbed vegetation, a heel print in soft soil, a broken branch at about the right height for someone Thomas's size walking through dense undergrowth. But darkness fell before Robert could follow the trail very far, and he was forced to make camp next to his son's abandoned tent. That night, as he and Martha huddled together in the back of their truck, both parents came to the sobering realization that their son was in serious trouble. In the morning, they would have to contact the authorities and hope that professional search teams could find Thomas before it was too late. The call to the Clallam County Sheriff's Department came at 6:30 a.m. on September 23rd, when Robert Mitchell walked to the nearest ranger station and reported his son missing. Deputy Frank Kowalski, a young officer who'd grown up in Port Angeles and knew the Olympic wilderness, as well as anyone in law enforcement, took the initial report and immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. Kowalski had seen missing person cases before, but something about Thomas Mitchell's disappearance struck him as particularly ominous. Experienced outdoorsmen didn't simply vanish without leaving some trace of their passage, especially not military veterans who'd been trained in survival and navigation. The fact that Thomas had left his truck keys behind suggested either a medical emergency so sudden that he couldn't return to camp, or some form of foul play. Within hours of receiving the report, Sheriff's Department had organized a full-scale search and rescue operation. Kowalski coordinated with the U.S. Forest Service, the Coast Guard, and volunteer search teams from throughout the Olympic Peninsula. The effort would eventually involve more than 50 people, including professional trackers, trained search dogs, and even a small aircraft equipped for aerial reconnaissance. The search teams were methodical and thorough, dividing the wilderness around Crystal Lake into grid sections and systematically combing each area for any sign of the missing man. They found the trail that Robert Mitchell had partially followed the night before, and the search dogs immediately picked up Thomas's scent. For the first time since his disappearance, there was hope that he might be found alive. The scent trail led northeast from Crystal Lake, following what appeared to be an old deer path that wound through increasingly dense forest toward the remote Timber Creek Valley area. Search team members marked their progress with colored ribbon, creating a visible trail that would guide additional searchers to the most promising areas. The dogs seemed confident in their tracking, moving steadily forward with their handlers close behind. For nearly 2 miles, the trail remained clear and consistent. Thomas had apparently followed this route at a steady pace, stopping occasionally at natural landmarks, but generally moving with purpose towards some specific destination. The searchers found a few pieces of evidence along the way: a partial boot print in soft soil, a thread caught on a thorn bush that matched the description of Thomas's hiking clothes, a spot where he'd apparently rested and eaten part of his trail rations. But then, at a rocky outcropping overlooking Timber Creek, the trail simply ended. The search dogs lost the scent completely, circling the area in confusion as their handlers tried to understand what had happened. One moment the trail was clear and strong. The next moment it was as if Thomas Mitchell had never existed. The rocky area was searched exhaustively over the following days. Every crevice and overhang was examined. Every possible hiding place or accident site was investigated. Teams rappelled down cliff faces and explored caves, looking for any sign that Thomas might have fallen or taken shelter. But they found nothing. No blood, no torn clothing, no indication that he had ever been in this area at all. The search expanded outward from the point where the trail ended, with teams covering hundreds of square miles of wilderness. Aircraft flew overhead in careful patterns, their crews scanning the forest canopy for any sign of movement or disturbance. Local Native American trackers from the nearby Elwha tribe were consulted, bringing centuries of traditional knowledge about the Olympic wilderness to bear on the mystery. Days turned into weeks as the search continued, with decreasing hope of finding Thomas alive. The September weather turned colder and wetter, bringing the first storms of the Pacific Northwest's notorious rainy season. Search conditions became increasingly dangerous as trails turned muddy and visibility decreased. Several volunteers were injured in falls or became temporarily lost themselves, forcing the search coordinators to scale back their efforts. By early October, nearly 3 weeks after Thomas Mitchell's disappearance, the official search was called off. Sheriff's Department investigators continued to follow up on leads and tips for several more weeks, but the massive coordinated effort involving dozens of volunteers and multiple agencies came to an end. The consensus among professional searchers was that Thomas had either suffered a fatal accident in terrain so remote that his body would never be recovered, or had encountered some form of foul play that left no trace. The failure to find any trace of Thomas Mitchell haunted the search teams, particularly Deputy Frank Kowalski, who had coordinated much of the effort. In his 15 years of law enforcement, Kowalski had never encountered a case quite like this one. Missing persons usually left some evidence of their fate. Bodies were eventually found, or at least personal items that provided clues about what had happened. But Thomas had simply vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. The case file remained open, but as months passed without new leads or evidence, it gradually moved from active investigation to cold case status. Thomas Mitchell became another name on the list of people who had disappeared in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, a reminder of how quickly the forest could claim those who ventured too far from civilization. For Robert and Martha Mitchell, the failure to find their son's body meant that grief could never fully complete its natural cycle. There was no funeral, no gravestone, no final ceremony to mark the end of Thomas's young life. Instead, there was only an empty chair at the dinner table and the terrible uncertainty that comes with not knowing whether someone you love is alive or dead. Martha clung to the hope that her son might still be alive somewhere, perhaps injured and unable to return home, or suffering from amnesia and living under another identity. She wrote letters to veterans' hospitals throughout the region, describing Thomas and asking if anyone matching his description had been admitted as an unknown patient. She contacted missing persons organizations and placed advertisements in newspapers from Seattle to San Francisco, always hoping for some word of her lost son. Robert dealt with the loss differently, channeling his grief into action. Every year on the anniversary of Thomas's disappearance, he would drive to the Olympic Peninsula and spend several days searching areas that hadn't been thoroughly covered during the original investigation. He became something of a fixture around Crystal Lake and the surrounding wilderness, a weathered man with haunted eyes who could often be seen walking forest trails and calling his son's name. Local residents around Port Angeles and the other Olympic Peninsula communities grew accustomed to seeing Robert Mitchell during his annual pilgrimages. Some thought his searches were futile, even unhealthy, but others understood the need that drove him to continue looking. The Olympic wilderness was vast enough to hide secrets for decades or even centuries. If Thomas's body was out there somewhere, Robert was determined to find it and bring his son home. The years passed slowly for the Mitchell family. Martha's health declined gradually, the stress and uncertainty of Thomas's disappearance taking a toll that no amount of medical care could fully address. She developed heart problems and chronic insomnia, spending long nights sitting by the kitchen window and watching the road, as if Thomas might still come driving up their gravel driveway with a reasonable explanation for his long absence. Robert continued working in the logging industry, But his co-workers noticed changes in him. He became quieter and more withdrawn, spending his lunch breaks staring off into the forest instead of joking with the other men. On several occasions, supervisors had to remind him to focus on his work when they caught him gazing into the trees with an expression of such longing that it made them uncomfortable. The local community never forgot about Thomas Mitchell's disappearance, even as other tragedies and mysteries claimed public attention. His case became part of Olympic Peninsula folklore, discussed in coffee shops and taverns whenever conversation turned to the region's unsolved mysteries. Some people developed theories about what might have happened: wild animal attacks, falls into unmapped cave systems, encounters with hermits or criminals living off the grid in the deep woods. But as the 1960s gave way to the 1970s and then the 1980s, Thomas Mitchell's disappearance gradually faded from active memory. New residents moved to the area who had never heard his story. The original search team members retired or moved away, taking their detailed knowledge of the case with them. Deputy Frank Kowalski, who had never stopped thinking about the missing veteran, eventually became sheriff and then retired. But he kept copies of Thomas's case file in his personal records, unable to let go of the mystery that had defined much of his career. By the 1990s, nearly 30 years after Thomas's disappearance, very few people remained who remembered the intensive search efforts or could still visualize the young veteran's face. The forest had reclaimed any traces of the search team's activities. The colored ribbons had long since weathered away. The temporary camps had been dismantled, and new growth had covered the paths where dozens of volunteers had once walked in hopes of finding a missing man. Robert Mitchell continued his annual searches well into his 60s, though age and arthritis made the long hikes increasingly difficult. Martha passed away in 1987, never knowing what had happened to her son. At her funeral, Robert stood beside the grave and made a promise to his deceased wife that he would never stop looking for Thomas, that someday he would bring their boy home and lay him to rest beside her. But even Robert's determination had limits. By the mid-1990s, approaching 70 years of age and suffering from the heart disease that would eventually claim his life, he could no longer manage the strenuous hikes into the Olympic wilderness. His final search took place in September 1995, 32 years after Thomas's disappearance, when Robert walked as far as Crystal Lake and spent the night camped beside the spot where his son's tent had once stood. That night, sitting alone by his campfire and listening to the same sounds that Thomas had heard on his last evening in the wilderness, Robert Mitchell finally accepted that he would never find his son's remains. The forest had claimed Thomas as completely as if it had swallowed him whole, leaving behind only memories and the terrible uncertainty that comes with losing someone without ever learning their fate. As Robert prepared to leave Crystal Lake for the final time, he carved a simple message into a large Douglas fir near the shoreline. Thomas Mitchell, Sept 15, 1963, forever in our hearts. It was a memorial that would stand for years to come, a testament to a father's love and the enduring mystery of what had happened to a young veteran who had sought peace in the wilderness and found something else entirely. The discovery that would finally solve the mystery of Thomas Mitchell's disappearance came from the most unlikely source imaginable. A 12-year-old boy whose curiosity and determination would succeed where decades of professional investigation had failed. Kevin Santos was not a typical child of the 1990s. While his classmates spent their free time playing video games or watching television, Kevin was drawn to stories of real-life mysteries and unsolved cases. Kevin lived in Port Angeles with his grandmother, Rosa Santos, who had moved to Washington from Los Angeles after her husband's death in 1994. Rosa worked as a housekeeper at the Olympic Lodge, one of the area's premier tourist destinations, and during school vacations, She often brought Kevin along to help with her duties. It was at the lodge that Kevin first learned about Thomas Mitchell's disappearance, listening to conversations between his grandmother and the lodge's owner, Frank Kowalski. Frank Kowalski was the same man who had served as a young deputy during the original search for Thomas Mitchell in 1963. Now in his early 60s and recently retired from his position as Clallam County Sheriff, Frank owned the Olympic Lodge with his wife and enjoyed sharing stories of the peninsula's history with guests and staff members. The Mitchell case remained one of his most vivid memories, and he often found himself thinking about the young veteran who had simply vanished into the wilderness. Rosa Santos was a good listener, and she encouraged Frank to tell his stories during the quiet evening hours when the lodge's daily operations were winding down. Kevin, who was supposed to be doing homework or reading quietly in the lodge's comfortable lobby, instead found himself captivated by Frank's accounts of search and rescue operations, criminal investigations, and the various mysteries that had defined his long career in law enforcement. The Thomas Mitchell case was different from anything else I'd ever seen, Frank told Rosa one evening in late 1997, as Kevin pretended to read a magazine while actually listening to every word. We had experienced trackers, trained search dogs, aircraft support and more volunteers than we knew what to do with. That young man's trail was clear as day for nearly 2 miles, and then it just stopped. Not faded away gradually like you'd expect if someone got lost or disoriented. It stopped completely, like he'd been lifted right off the ground. Kevin's imagination was immediately captured by the image of someone simply vanishing in the middle of a forest trail. He pestered his grandmother with questions about the case, wanting to know every detail that Frank had shared and begging for more information. Rosa, who found her grandson's interest in mysteries both amusing and concerning, suggested that Kevin ask Frank directly about the case if he was so fascinated by it. The conversation that followed would change Kevin's life and ultimately solve a mystery that had puzzled investigators for over 30 years. Frank Kowalski, who had never had children of his own, was charmed by Kevin's earnest questions and obvious intelligence. The boy had clearly been thinking seriously about the case, asking the kinds of detailed questions that showed he understood the complexities involved. "What if the trail didn't really end?" Kevin asked during one of their conversations. "What if something happened that the search dogs couldn't detect, like if Mr. Mitchell went somewhere the scent couldn't follow?" Frank was impressed by the boy's reasoning. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that good investigators develop," he told Kevin. "We considered possibilities like that during the original search. Maybe he fell into water and the current carried his scent away, or maybe he encountered someone who helped him cover his tracks. But we searched every stream and pond in that area, and there was no evidence of other people being in the vicinity." Kevin spent the winter of 1997-98 researching everything he could find about the Mitchell case. He visited the Port Angeles Library regularly, reading through old newspaper archives and making copies of every article that mentioned Thomas's disappearance. He studied topographical maps of the Olympic Peninsula, learning to identify terrain features and understand how the landscape might affect search operations. Most importantly, he began to develop his own theories about what might have happened to the missing veteran. The breakthrough in Kevin's thinking came when he was reading about cave systems in the Olympic Mountains. Washington State was known for its extensive underground formations, some of which had never been fully explored or mapped. The possibility that Thomas Mitchell had fallen into a cave or underground chamber would explain why his trail ended so abruptly and why searchers had never found any trace of him. When Kevin presented this theory to Frank Kowalski, the former sheriff was initially skeptical. "We considered that possibility during the original search," Frank explained. "The area where the trail ended was thoroughly examined for any signs of cave openings or sinkholes. Our teams rappelled down every cliff face and explored every crevice they could find." But Kevin had done more research than the 1963 search teams had been able to accomplish with the limited resources available at that time. Using modern geological surveys and cave mapping data that hadn't existed 35 years earlier, he had identified several locations in the Timber Creek Valley area where underground formations were known to exist, but had never been fully explored. What if the cave entrance was hidden somehow? Kevin persisted. Or what if it was so narrow that the search teams missed it? And what if something happened over the years that made it easier to find now than it was back then? Frank found himself impressed once again by Kevin's reasoning. The boy was thinking like a seasoned investigator, considering possibilities that others might overlook and approaching the problem from fresh angles. More importantly, Kevin's passion for solving the mystery reminded Frank of his own younger self, when every case had seemed like an exciting puzzle waiting to be solved. As spring approached in 1998, 35 years after Thomas Mitchell's disappearance, Kevin began lobbying his grandmother to let him visit the area where the search had taken place. Rosa was initially reluctant. The Olympic wilderness could be dangerous even for experienced adults, and she had no desire to risk her grandson's safety in pursuit of what might be nothing more than a childhood fantasy. But Kevin's persistence eventually wore down her resistance, especially when Frank Kowalski offered to accompany them on a carefully planned expedition to Crystal Lake. Frank's law enforcement background and knowledge of the area reassured Rosa, and she finally agreed to let Kevin explore the site of his obsession under proper adult supervision. The trip was planned for late August 1998, during a period when weather conditions in the Olympics were typically at their most favorable. Frank arranged for the necessary permits and safety equipment, while Kevin continued his research and preparation with the dedication of someone much older than his 12 years. He studied wilderness survival techniques, learned to use a compass and GPS device, and even practiced rock climbing at a local gymnasium to prepare for the challenging terrain they might encounter. As the date of their expedition approached, Kevin found himself both excited and nervous about what they might discover. Part of him hoped they would find definitive evidence about Thomas Mitchell's fate, finally solving a mystery that had haunted the Olympic Peninsula for more than 3 decades. But another part of him wondered if he was setting himself up for disappointment, pursuing a theory that would prove to be just another dead end in a case that had already frustrated so many investigators. The morning of August 24, 1998, dawned clear and warm in Port Angeles, with the kind of perfect Pacific Northwest weather that made locals appreciate living in one of the most beautiful regions of the country. Kevin had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with anticipation and nervous energy. Rosa had packed enough food and supplies for a small army, despite Frank's assurances that they would be hiking for only 2 days and staying at an established campground. The drive to Crystal Lake took them through some of the most spectacular scenery in the Olympic Peninsula, past old-growth forests and mountain vistas that had changed little since Thomas Mitchell had made the same journey 35 years earlier. Kevin pressed his face to the truck window, trying to imagine what the missing veteran had been thinking during his final drive into the wilderness. When they reached Crystal Lake, Kevin felt a strange mixture of excitement and solemnity. This was sacred ground in a way, the last place where Thomas Mitchell had been seen alive, the starting point of a mystery that had defined much of Frank Kowalski's career and captured Kevin's imagination so completely. The lake itself was exactly as beautiful as the old newspaper articles had described, with crystal-clear water reflecting the surrounding forest like a perfect mirror. Frank pointed out the approximate location where Thomas's campsite had been discovered, now marked only by a small clearing where the forest growth looked slightly different from the surrounding area. They made their own camp nearby, and Kevin spent the afternoon exploring the shoreline and trying to understand what Thomas might have been feeling during his final days beside this remote mountain lake. That evening, as they sat around their campfire eating dinner and watching the sun set behind the Olympic peaks, Frank shared more details about the original search than he had ever revealed before. He described the hope and determination of the early days, when everyone believed Thomas would be found alive. He talked about the growing desperation as days turned to weeks without any significant leads, and the ultimate heartbreak of calling off the search without answers. Thomas's parents never got over it, Frank told Kevin as the fire crackled between them. His mother held on to hope until the day she died, always thinking he might still be out there somewhere. His father spent 20 years searching these woods every September, always hoping he might find something we missed. It was the most tragic thing I've ever seen. Good people destroyed by not knowing what happened to their son. Kevin listened to these stories with the seriousness of someone much older, understanding that he was not just pursuing an intellectual puzzle, but trying to bring peace to families who had suffered for decades without answers. The weight of that responsibility settled on his young shoulders as he stared into the dancing flames and thought about the magnitude of what he was attempting to accomplish. The next morning, August 25th, Kevin woke before dawn with a sense of nervous anticipation that made it impossible to eat breakfast. Today they would hike to the area where Thomas Mitchell's trail had ended, where the most intensive search efforts had been concentrated, where Kevin hoped to find the clues that had eluded everyone else for 35 years. Frank had brought copies of the original search maps, yellowed with age, but still showing the precise locations where various teams had concentrated their efforts. The hike to the rocky outcropping where Thomas's trail had ended took them through the same terrain that dozens of searchers had covered in 1963, following deer paths and game trails that wound through increasingly dense forest toward the remote Timber Creek Valley. As they hiked, Frank pointed out landmarks and terrain features that had been significant during the original search. Here was where the search dogs had been most confident in their tracking. There was the spot where Thomas had apparently stopped to rest and eat some of his trail rations. This fallen log had been moved aside by search teams looking for any clues underneath. The forest seemed to whisper with the ghosts of that long-ago search effort, and Kevin found himself imagining the voices of dozens of volunteers calling Thomas's name, the baying of bloodhounds following a scent trail, the sound of helicopters overhead scanning the canopy for any sign of movement. All of that desperate activity had taken place in these same woods, and yet somehow Thomas Mitchell had remained hidden. They reached the rocky outcropping where the trail ended just after noon, during the hottest part of what was turning into an unusually warm late summer day. The 1998 summer had been one of the driest on record in the Pacific Northwest, and the effects were visible throughout the forest. Streams that normally ran year-round were reduced to trickles, and areas that were usually muddy were now hard-packed and dusty. It was these drought conditions that would prove to be the key to Kevin's success, where so many others had failed. As they explored the rocky area where Thomas's scent trail had ended, Kevin noticed something that would have been invisible under normal weather conditions. The rocky outcropping that had appeared solid to the 1963 searchers was actually a complex formation with deep cracks and fissures that were normally hidden by moisture and vegetation. One particular crack, partially concealed by a large boulder that had shifted slightly over the decades, caught Kevin's attention. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it appeared to extend much deeper into the rock formation than was visible from the surface. And caught on a sharp edge of stone, weathered and faded but still recognizable, was a small piece of fabric that looked like it might once have been part of a hiking boot. Kevin's heart began to pound as he called Frank over to examine his discovery. The former sheriff approached with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to get his hopes up too quickly. But even his experienced eye could see that Kevin had found something significant. The fabric was old, consistent with clothing that might have been worn in 1963, and its location suggested that someone had passed through this opening at some point in the past. "We need to be very careful here," Frank warned Kevin as they examined the narrow opening more closely. "Cave systems can be extremely dangerous, especially for people who aren't properly equipped. If this really does lead to where Thomas Mitchell ended up, we need to call in professional teams with the right gear and experience." But Kevin's curiosity and determination were stronger than his caution. He had spent months preparing for this moment, and the possibility of finally solving the Thomas Mitchell mystery was too compelling to ignore. Before Frank could stop him, Kevin had squeezed through the narrow opening and dropped into what appeared to be a larger underground chamber. The cave system that Kevin discovered was far more extensive than anyone could have imagined from examining the surface. What had started as a tight squeeze through a rock crevice opened into a network of interconnected chambers that extended deep into the hillside. Kevin's flashlight beam revealed smooth rock walls, formations that looked like they had been carved by underground water flow, and passages that led off in multiple directions. But it was what Kevin found scattered across the floor of the main chamber that confirmed his worst fears and greatest hopes simultaneously. Human bones, bleached white by decades of underground darkness, lay scattered throughout the cave system. Among them were the unmistakable remains of clothing and personal effects that had somehow survived the passage of time. Near what appeared to be the most complete set of remains, Kevin found a metal dog tag that made his hands shake as he read the inscription. Mitchell, Thomas J. R.A. 19847362, B. 15, Mar 41, RC. It was Thomas Mitchell's military identification tag, confirming that Kevin had indeed found the final resting place of the man who had vanished 35 years earlier. But as Kevin's flashlight beam swept across the cave floor, he realized with growing horror that Thomas Mitchell had not been the only victim to meet his fate in this underground chamber. The bones scattered throughout the cave belonged to multiple individuals, men, women, and even what appeared to be children, based on the size of some of the skeletal remains. Among the bones, Kevin found personal items that suggested the victims had come from different time periods, spanning several decades. A woman's purse with a clasp style popular in the 1950s, a man's pocket watch that had stopped at 3:17, its hands frozen in time. Children's clothing that looked like it could have been from the 1940s or even earlier. The implications were terrifying. This cave had been the site of multiple disappearances over many years, and Thomas Mitchell had been just one victim in a much larger pattern of violence. Kevin's discovery would soon reveal the most disturbing truth of all. Somewhere in the Olympic wilderness, a predator had lived and hunted for decades, using this cave system as his base of operations and final resting place for his victims. The case of Thomas Mitchell's disappearance was about to become something much larger and more terrifying than anyone had ever imagined. The most chilling discovery came when Kevin's flashlight illuminated the back wall of the main cave chamber. Carved into the rock were crude symbols and markings that appeared to be some form of record-keeping or ritualistic notation. Dozens of vertical lines were scratched into the stone, similar to the marks Thomas had noted in his final journal entry when he discovered the abandoned cabin. But these marks were more extensive and systematic, suggesting that someone had been keeping track of events or victims over an extended period. Below the tally marks were other carvings that made Kevin's blood run cold. Rough sketches that appeared to represent human figures, some of them clearly depicting scenes of violence or torture, names and dates scratched into the rock, documenting what appeared to be a decades-long killing spree that had claimed victims throughout the Olympic Peninsula region. And most disturbing of all, fresh-looking scratches that suggested this underground chamber had been visited relatively recently. Kevin's nerve finally broke when he heard sounds coming from one of the deeper passages, a shuffling noise like footsteps, accompanied by what sounded like labored breathing. The realization that the killer might still be active, still using this cave system as his base of operations, sent waves of panic through the 12-year-old's mind. Whatever evil had claimed Thomas Mitchell and the other victims might still be lurking in the depths of this underground maze. Scrambling toward the narrow entrance through which he'd entered, Kevin squeezed back through the opening and emerged into the afternoon sunlight, gasping and shaking. Frank Kowalski took one look at the boy's terrified expression and immediately understood that Kevin had discovered something far worse than a simple hiking accident or case of someone getting lost in the wilderness. "We need to get out of here right now," Kevin managed to say between gasps, his voice shaking with fear and adrenaline. "There's someone down there, Mr. Kowalski, someone who's been killing people for years, and I think they might still be alive." Frank's law enforcement training kicked in immediately. He helped Kevin gather their gear while scanning the surrounding forest for any signs of danger, then led the boy away from the cave entrance at a rapid pace that was just short of running. Their top priority was getting back to civilization and contacting the authorities before whoever was responsible for the cave's gruesome contents realized they had been discovered. The hike back to Crystal Lake seemed to take forever, with both Kevin and Frank jumping at every sound in the forest around them. The peaceful wilderness that had seemed so beautiful that morning now felt menacing and full of hidden threats. Every shadow could conceal a watching presence. Every sound could signal approaching danger. The knowledge that a killer had been operating in these woods for decades transformed their perception of the environment completely. They reached their campsite just as the sun was setting, throwing long shadows across Crystal Lake that seemed to harbor unknown dangers. Frank immediately began breaking camp with urgent efficiency while Kevin kept watch, his young eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Both of them understood that they needed to reach Port Angeles and contact law enforcement as quickly as possible before whoever was responsible for the horrors in the cave realized their secret had been discovered. The drive back to town was made in tense silence, with Kevin clutching the dog tag and other evidence he had retrieved from the cave while Frank pushed his truck as fast as he dared on the winding mountain roads. The boy's discovery had solved the 35-year-old mystery of Thomas Mitchell's disappearance, but it had also opened a much darker chapter in the history of the Olympic Peninsula. The peaceful wilderness that attracted thousands of visitors each year had been hiding a secret that would shock the entire Pacific Northwest. As they reached the outskirts of Port Angeles, Frank was already planning the phone calls he would need to make to his former colleagues in the sheriff's department. Kevin's discovery would require a major investigation involving multiple law enforcement agencies, forensic specialists, and search teams. The cave system would need to be thoroughly explored and documented. The remains would need to be identified and returned to their families. And most importantly, they would need to determine whether the killer responsible for these crimes was still alive and active. The investigation that followed Kevin Santos's discovery would become one of the largest and most complex criminal cases in Pacific Northwest history. Within hours of Frank Kowalski's call to the Clallam County Sheriff's Department, a full team of investigators was being assembled to explore the cave system and document what Kevin had found in those dark underground chambers. Sheriff Maria Rodriguez, who had succeeded Frank Kowalski in the position several years earlier, coordinated the response with the FBI, the Washington State Patrol, and specialized forensic teams from the University of Washington. The cave entrance was secured and treated as a major crime scene, with investigators using sophisticated equipment to map the underground chambers and carefully catalogue every piece of evidence they discovered. The forensic examination of the cave system took more than 2 weeks and revealed details that shocked even experienced law enforcement professionals. The remains of at least 9 individuals were recovered from various chambers throughout the underground complex, representing victims who had disappeared over a span of nearly 30 years, from the early 1940s through Thomas Mitchell's death in 1963. Each set of remains told a story of horror that investigators struggled to comprehend. The victims included families who had disappeared while camping, individual hikers who had vanished without a trace, and even local residents who had simply gone missing from their homes in nearby communities. The killer had apparently operated with complete impunity for decades, selecting victims from throughout the Olympic Peninsula and bringing them to his underground lair for torture and murder. The forensic evidence painted a picture of a predator who had lived like a hermit in the cave system, emerging periodically to hunt human prey in the surrounding wilderness. The underground chambers contained the remains of makeshift furniture, stored food supplies, weapons and personal belongings that suggested continuous occupation over many years. Most disturbing were the detailed records the killer had kept of his crimes, carved into the rock walls and scratched onto pieces of metal and wood. Thomas Mitchell's remains were identified through his dog tags, dental records, and personal effects that had somehow survived 3.5 decades in the underground environment. The forensic examination revealed that he had been alive for some time after his capture, suggesting that his final hours had been filled with unimaginable suffering. His military training and physical conditioning had apparently made him a particularly challenging victim for the killer, based on evidence of prolonged struggle and resistance found throughout the cave system. The other victims were gradually identified through missing persons reports, dental records, and personal items found with their remains. They included the Hendricks family, parents and 2 young children who had disappeared while camping near Lake Crescent in 1959. Margaret Sullivan, a Seattle teacher who had vanished during a solo hiking trip in 1957. James Porter, a logger from Forks who had gone missing in 1955. Each identification brought closure to families who had waited decades for answers, while simultaneously revealing the full scope of the killer's decades-long reign of terror. But the most pressing question for investigators was whether the person responsible for these crimes was still alive and potentially active. The evidence suggested that the cave system had been abandoned sometime in the late 1960s, but there were disturbing signs that someone had visited the site more recently. Fresh scratches on the rock walls, recently disturbed bones, and other indicators suggested that the killer might have returned periodically to revisit his underground trophy room. The investigation expanded beyond the cave system to examine unsolved disappearances throughout the Pacific Northwest, spanning several decades. Detectives identified dozens of cases that fit the pattern of the cave killings, individuals or families who had vanished without a trace in wilderness areas, leaving no evidence of their fate. While not all of these cases could be definitively linked to the same perpetrator, the similarities were striking enough to suggest that the Olympic Peninsula cave was just one of potentially multiple killing sites. Psychological profilers brought in to analyze the case developed a portrait of the killer that helped explain how he had been able to operate undetected for so long. They theorized that he was likely a military deserter or someone fleeing from the law who had chosen to disappear into the wilderness rather than face justice for previous crimes. His survival skills and intimate knowledge of the Olympic Peninsula terrain had allowed him to live off the grid while selecting and stalking victims with minimal risk of detection. The killer's methods suggested someone with military or law enforcement training, based on the sophisticated tracking and capture techniques he employed. The elaborate nature of his underground lair suggested someone with engineering or construction knowledge, capable of modifying natural cave formations to serve his purposes. Most chilling was the evidence that he had studied his victims extensively before attacking, sometimes stalking them for days or weeks to learn their routines and vulnerabilities. The search for the killer himself proved fruitless. By the time Kevin Santos discovered the cave in 1998, any trail had gone cold decades earlier. Investigators theorized that the perpetrator had either died in the wilderness, moved to hunting grounds in another region, or possibly been incarcerated or killed for unrelated crimes. The lack of recent activity in the cave suggested that his reign of terror in the Olympic Peninsula had ended sometime in the late 1960s, though the reason remained unknown. Despite the inability to bring the killer to justice, the investigation provided crucial closure for families who had waited decades for answers about their missing loved ones. Martha Mitchell had passed away in 1987 without ever learning what happened to her son Thomas, but other family members were finally able to lay their loved ones to rest with dignity and certainty about their fate. The Hendricks family case was particularly poignant. Their relatives had maintained hope for 40 years that the family of four had somehow survived their 1959 camping trip and were living under new identities somewhere. The discovery of their remains in the cave was devastating, but also brought peace to siblings and cousins who could finally stop wondering and begin the process of grieving properly. Kevin Santos struggled significantly with the psychological aftermath of his discovery. The 12-year-old had gone into the cave, hoping to solve an interesting mystery, and instead uncovered evidence of decades of torture and murder. He suffered from nightmares and anxiety attacks for months afterward, requiring counseling to help him process what he had witnessed in those dark underground chambers. Frank Kowalski, despite his law enforcement background, was also deeply affected by Kevin's discovery. The case had haunted him for 35 years, and learning the horrific truth about Thomas Mitchell's fate was both a relief and a source of new trauma. The knowledge that such evil had been operating in the wilderness he loved, claiming victims while search teams looked in all the wrong places, filled him with a mixture of satisfaction at finally having answers and horror at the scope of the crimes. The Olympic Peninsula community reacted to the revelations with shock and disbelief. The idea that a serial killer had been operating in their backyard for decades, selecting victims from among hikers and campers who came to enjoy the area's natural beauty, shattered many people's sense of security. Tourism to the region declined temporarily as visitors reconsidered the safety of venturing into wilderness areas that had harbored such darkness. Local authorities implemented new safety protocols for wilderness areas, including improved communication systems, more frequent ranger patrols, and better coordination between law enforcement agencies when hikers or campers were reported missing. The Thomas Mitchell case became a training example for search and rescue teams, illustrating how criminal activity could masquerade as simple disappearances, and the importance of considering all possibilities during missing person investigations. The cave system where the murders had taken place was permanently sealed by the National Park Service in early 1999, both to preserve it as a crime scene and to prevent morbid curiosity seekers from disturbing what had essentially become a mass grave. A small memorial plaque was installed at a nearby trailhead, listing the names of all identified victims and serving as a reminder that even the most beautiful natural places can hide unimaginable secrets. Frank Kowalski organized a memorial service at Crystal Lake in the summer of 1999, bringing together family members of all the identified victims for a ceremony of remembrance and healing. The gathering served multiple purposes: honoring the memory of those who had died, providing closure for families who had waited decades for answers, and helping the local community begin to heal from the knowledge of what had happened in their midst. Thomas Mitchell's remains were finally returned to his family and laid to rest beside his mother Martha in the Colville Cemetery, where she had been buried 12 years earlier. His father Robert had passed away in 1995, just 3 years before his son's remains were discovered, never knowing that his decades of searching the Olympic wilderness had actually brought him within miles of where Thomas had died. At the funeral service, Frank Kowalski delivered a eulogy that captured both the tragedy of Thomas's death and the significance of finally bringing him home. "Thomas Mitchell went into those woods looking for peace," Frank said to the gathered mourners. "He found something else instead, something evil that had been hiding in the shadows for far too long." But his story didn't end in that cave. It ended here, today, with all of us gathered to remember him and to make sure that he and all the other victims are never forgotten. Kevin Santos, now 13 years old and still struggling with the trauma of his discovery, attended the memorial service with his grandmother Rosa. The experience of seeing the families find closure helped him begin to understand that his terrifying discovery had served a greater purpose. The nightmares would continue for years, but he gradually came to accept that his curiosity and determination had brought peace to people who had suffered for decades without answers. The case had a lasting impact on Kevin's life trajectory. His experience with the Mitchell investigation sparked an interest in criminal justice that would eventually lead him to pursue a career in law enforcement. Years later, as a detective with the Seattle Police Department, Kevin would often think about the lessons he learned from Frank Kowalski about the importance of never giving up on cold cases and always considering possibilities that others might overlook. Frank Kowalski lived until 2010, passing away at the age of 73, with the satisfaction of knowing that the case that had defined much of his career had finally been solved. He maintained the Olympic Lodge until his death, continuing to share the story of Thomas Mitchell's disappearance and discovery with guests who were interested in the region's history. The case became part of local folklore, told and retold as both a cautionary tale about wilderness safety and a testament to the importance of never giving up hope. The broader investigation into similar disappearances throughout the Pacific Northwest continued for several more years, with detectives attempting to link other unsolved cases to the same perpetrator. While definitive connections were difficult to establish after so many decades, the cave discovery helped solve several additional missing person cases and provided closure for families throughout Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. Today, more than 25 years after Kevin Santos's discovery, the Olympic Peninsula wilderness continues to attract visitors from around the world who come to experience its natural beauty and pristine wilderness. The dark chapter represented by the cave killings has become part of the region's history, acknowledged but not allowed to overshadow the area's reputation as one of America's most spectacular natural destinations. The memorial plaque near Crystal Lake serves as a quiet reminder of the victims who lost their lives in these woods, but it also represents something more positive: the triumph of persistence and courage over evil, the importance of never giving up on the missing, and the healing power of finally knowing the truth. Thomas Mitchell's quest for peace in the wilderness ended in tragedy, but his story ultimately became one of redemption, bringing closure to families and communities that had been wounded by decades of uncertainty. The forest has reclaimed the areas where search teams once combed through underbrush looking for clues. New growth covers the scars left by the investigation, and the natural cycles of the Pacific Northwest wilderness continue unchanged. But the memory of Thomas Mitchell and the other victims lives on in the stories told by guides and park rangers, ensuring that their sacrifice is never forgotten and that future generations understand both the beauty and the potential dangers of venturing into the wild places of the world. In the end, Kevin Santos's childhood curiosity and determination succeeded where decades of professional investigation had failed, proving that sometimes the most important discoveries come from the most unlikely sources. The 12-year-old boy who squeezed through a narrow cave opening in search of answers had not only solved one of the Pacific Northwest's most enduring mysteries, but had also brought peace to families who had waited 35 years to learn the fate of their loved ones. The case of Thomas Mitchell's disappearance and the subsequent discovery of the Olympic Peninsula serial killer remains one of the most significant criminal investigations in Washington state history. A reminder that even in our modern world, there are still secrets hidden in the wilderness waiting to be uncovered by those brave enough to seek the truth.